The foundation of Atlantis begins not with human agency, but with divine partition, the moment when the Olympian gods divided the earth among themselves by just allotment, a phrase encoding an entire political theology. This partition is not arbitrary territorial distribution, but cosmological legislation. Each god receives a domain whose physical characteristics correspond to the god's metaphysical nature. Poseidon receives Atlantis, not because it happens to be available, but because the island's geological structure, volcanic, surrounded by deep ocean, rich in subterranean metals and hot springs, mirrors the god's ontological portfolio: earthquakes, oceans, horses, and the liminal zone between surface and depth. The divine allotment is therefore an act of cosmic zoning, assigning each portion of the earth to the deity whose nature can most fully actualize its potential. The geographical position of Atlantis, beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the open Atlantic, carries semiotic weight operating on multiple registers. The pillars functioned in Greek cosmography as the boundary between the known and the unknown, the civilized and the barbaric, the measurable and the immeasurable. By placing Atlantis beyond this boundary, Plato positions it in a zone of epistemological indeterminacy, a space where extraordinary claims cannot be verified through ordinary means. This is not narrative convenience but philosophical strategy. It creates a space where imagination operates unconstrained by empirical verification, allowing Plato to construct a civilization whose characteristics are determined entirely by philosophical requirements rather than geographical facts. The island's size, larger than Libya and Asia together, establishes a scale exceeding any known landmass in the ancient Mediterranean, creating a civilization whose material resources are effectively unlimited. This unlimited resource base is philosophically essential. It eliminates scarcity as a variable in the civilization's moral equation, ensuring that any subsequent moral failure cannot be attributed to material necessity. The Atlanteans do not become corrupt because they lack resources. They become corrupt despite possessing every resource imaginable. This elimination of material excuse transforms the narrative from a story about economic failure into a story about moral failure in its purest form. Corruption arising not from deprivation, but from abundance, not from necessity, but from choice. Poseidon's encounter with Kleito, the mortal woman who becomes the mother of the Atlantean royal line, introduces the foundational act of divine-human hybridization, determining the entire subsequent trajectory of the civilization. Kleito is not randomly selected. She is an orphan living on a hill at the center of the island, a figure whose isolation and centrality mark her as a sacred vessel prepared for divine union. Poseidon's response is simultaneously erotic and architectural. He fortifies the hill with concentric rings of sea and land, creating a structure that is at once a fortress protecting his beloved, a temple marking the site of divine-human contact, and a cosmological diagram expressing the relationship between divine center and material periphery. The concentric ring structure constitutes the architectural DNA of the entire civilization, a spatial grammar replicated at every scale, from the capital city's layout to the political system's organization to the legal code structure. 3 rings of water alternating with 2 rings of land, surrounding a central island. This pattern encodes a mathematical relationship between center and periphery, between sacred core and profane exterior, governing every aspect of Atlantean life. The center, where Kleito dwells and where the temple of Poseidon will later stand, is the point of maximum sacrality, the axis mundi around which the entire civilization rotates. Each successive ring represents a diminution of sacred intensity, a gradual transition from divine presence to human habitation, to commercial activity, to military deployment, to agricultural production. The civilization's spatial organization is a materialized theology, a physical expression of the metaphysical principle that divine power radiates outward from a sacred center, diminishing in intensity as it moves toward the periphery. The hydrogeological engineering Poseidon performs, creating hot and cold springs on the central island, reveals a divine intelligence operating through the manipulation of natural forces rather than their suspension. The hot spring represents the chthonic fire beneath the Earth's surface, Poseidon's domain of seismic power made manifest as thermal energy. The cold spring represents the oceanic depths, the vast reservoir over which Poseidon rules. Together they create a binary system of elemental forces whose interaction generates the conditions for human flourishing. The isolation of the central island, accessible only by water, creates a sacred precinct whose physical inaccessibility mirrors its metaphysical exclusivity. Every journey to the center requires crossing water, an act representing purification, transition, and the crossing of ontological boundaries in Greek religious symbolism. The 10 sons Poseidon fathers with Kleito, 5 pairs of twins, establish the political architecture through an act of divine procreation that is simultaneously biological and constitutional. The number 10 represents completeness in Pythagorean number theory, the tetractys, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 equal toten, ensuring that the political structure reflects the mathematical harmony of the cosmos. The pairing as twins introduces binary complementarity into the political system, each ruler paired with a counterpart, creating mutual balance, preventing any single lineage from accumulating unchecked power. Atlas, the firstborn, receives primacy but not absolute authority. His sovereignty is constrained by 9 co-rulers, whose legitimacy derives from the same divine source. Atlas's elevation to supreme kingship establishes a political theology in which sovereignty derives not from conquest, election, or social contract, but from primogeniture within a divine lineage. This derivation carries implications distinguishing Atlantean political theory from every other model of political legitimacy in the ancient Greek world. In democratic Athens, sovereignty resided in assembled citizens. In oligarchic Sparta, in a council of elders and dual kings. In various tyrannies, in the personal power of the tyrant. In Atlantis, sovereignty resides in blood, specifically in the proportion of divine blood flowing through the ruler's veins, with Atlas possessing the highest concentration as the firstborn son of a god. The naming of the island after Atlas reveals the Platonic understanding of naming as ontological determination rather than mere labeling. To name the island Atlantis is to define its essential nature. It is Atlas's island, an extension of his identity, a physical manifestation of his divine human nature. The ocean surrounding it is Atlas's ocean, a liquid domain mirroring the solid domain of the island. This onomastic imperialism, extending a single name across an entire geographical region, reflects the political reality of Atlas's sovereignty. His authority extends outward to encompass the surrounding sea, creating a maritime empire whose boundaries are defined not by physical barriers, but by the reach of royal power. The distribution of the remaining 9 portions among Atlas's brothers creates a federal structure balancing unity with diversity, central authority with regional autonomy. Each brother receives a distinct territory with its own resources, population, and administrative requirements, creating 10 semi-autonomous kingdoms united under Atlas's supreme authority. This federal structure anticipates with remarkable precision the political challenges confronting actual federal systems, the tension between central coordination and regional independence, the problem of maintaining unity among rulers possessing independent power bases, and the difficulty of ensuring federal obligations are met when enforcement mechanisms are limited by constituent autonomy. The constitutional framework governing relations among the 10 kings, preserved in inscriptions on the Pillar of Orichalcum in Poseidon's temple, represents legal technology of extraordinary sophistication. By inscribing fundamental laws on a pillar of the rarest and most sacred material available, the Atlantean constitution achieves permanence and authority transcending any individual ruler's will. The laws are literally set in metal, fixed, immutable, resistant to the erosion of time and political convenience. This material fixity contrasts with the fluidity of oral legal traditions, subject to gradual modification through selective memory and creative reinterpretation. The Orichalcum pillar functions as a constitutional anchor, preventing the legal foundation from drifting under changing circumstances. The prohibition against kings making war upon one another constitutes the foundational principle of the federal system. Internal conflict is categorically forbidden regardless of provocation. This is not merely practical but a theological imperative. Since all 10 kings descend from the same god, conflict among them would constitute divine self-contradiction, Poseidon's blood warring against itself. The prohibition transforms political peace from pragmatic preference into sacred obligation, violation of which constitutes not merely political crime, but theological offense. The periodic assemblies at Poseidon's temple create a rhythm of political life, alternating between regional autonomy and federal gathering. These assemblies are not merely political meetings but religious ceremonies, occasions on which kings reaffirm their divine connection through ritual sacrifice and collective oath-taking. The political and religious are fused to a degree making their separation conceptually impossible. To participate in political deliberation is to participate in religious ritual. This fusion ensures political authority remains grounded in religious legitimacy, preventing the emergence of purely secular politics that might challenge the divine constitutional foundation. The bull sacrifice forming the centerpiece of these assemblies, kings hunting a bull within Poseidon's sacred precinct using only staves and nooses without iron weapons, encodes complex symbolic meanings. The bull, as Poseidon's sacred animal, represents the divine power sustaining the royal lineages. Its sacrifice represents the king's acknowledgement that their power derives from and remains dependent upon divine favor. The prohibition against iron weapons strips the hunt of martial character, transforming it into a test of inherent personal excellence, strength, agility, courage, and capacity for coordinated action. The hunt is a ritual demonstration of the qualities legitimating royal authority, not technological superiority, but personal virtue. The blood of the sacrificed bull, mixed with wine and poured over the sacred inscriptions, creates a sacramental substance mediating between divine law and human rulers. This blood-wine mixture is simultaneously a libation to Poseidon, acknowledging divine sovereignty, a seal upon the constitutional text, renewing inscribed law's authority, and a communion among kings, binding them through shared participation in sacred substance. The oath kings swear afterward, pledging to judge and be judged according to inscribed laws, creates reciprocal obligation binding rulers to the same legal standards they impose on subjects. This legal equality between rulers and ruled, grounded in common divine origin of the constitutional text, prevents tyranny, power unconstrained by law. The golden tablets on which kings inscribe their oaths and judgments, deposited in the temple as permanent records, create institutional memory accumulating over generations, building a body of precedent supplementing the original constitutional text. These tablets function as a judicial archive, preserving not merely abstract principles, but their concrete application to specific cases. Over time, this archive would develop into something resembling a common law tradition. The combination of fixed constitutional text and evolving judicial archive creates a legal system of remarkable flexibility, Fundamental principles remain immutable, while application adapts through accumulated precedent. The Temple of Poseidon, crowning the central island, represents the architectural culmination of the civilization's theological self-understanding, a structure whose physical dimensions, material composition, and decorative program encode the entire metaphysical framework within which Atlantean culture operates. Each detail communicates a proposition about the relationship between divine power, material reality, and human aspiration, contributing to the narrative's overarching argument about civilizational flourishing and decline. The temple's exterior, sheathed in silver with pinnacles of gold, establishes a chromatic hierarchy mapping precious metals onto architectural zones according to symbolic value. Silver, associated with lunar light, covers the walls, the protective boundary between sacred interior and profane exterior. Gold, associated with solar light and supreme divinity, crowns the pinnacles, points of maximum elevation where the temple reaches toward the heavens. This chromatic arrangement creates a visual argument about the structure of the sacred. Divinity intensifies as one moves upward, from silver boundary to golden apex. The temple is not merely a building, but a cosmological diagram rendered in precious metals, a three-dimensional model of the relationship between earth and heaven, communicating theological content through visual perception rather than verbal instruction. The interior intensifies this chromatic theology through Orichalcum, the mysterious metal Kleito describes as the most precious of metals except gold that sparkled like fire. Orichalcum occupies a unique position in the Atlantean material hierarchy, rarer than silver but less valuable than gold, creating a tripartite metallic system, gold, Orichalcum, silver, paralleling the Republic's tripartite social system, philosopher kings, auxiliaries, producers. The ceiling of ivory decorated with all three metals creates a composite surface representing the harmonious integration of social orders they symbolize. The temple's interior is a microcosm of the ideal state, a space where hierarchical relationships among social classes are expressed through hierarchical arrangement of precious materials. The golden statue of Poseidon driving 6 winged horses, surrounded by 100 nereids on dolphins, constitutes the theological centerpiece of the entire civilization. The statue's scale, Poseidon's head touching the ceiling, communicates divine magnitude through physical dimension, creating overwhelming presence, dominating any worshipper's consciousness. The 6 winged horses represent mastery over both terrestrial and aerial domains, a departure from conventional association with earthly horses that elevates Poseidon's power to cosmic proportions. The 100 nereids populate the space with a marine court, transforming the temple interior into an underwater palace, a terrestrial recreation of Poseidon's oceanic domain. The Orichalcum wall encircling the temple precinct separates sacred from profane space with a material barrier whose symbolic significance exceeds its physical strength. As the metal unique to Atlantis, Orichalcum represents the civilization's distinctive identity, its special relationship with Poseidon, its unique position in the divine economy. Constructing the temple boundary from this uniquely Atlantean material asserts that the sacred precinct is specifically Atlantean, a space whose sacrality derives from the particular relationship between Poseidon and his founded civilization. The wall functions as a material signature, a physical inscription of Atlantean identity upon the boundary of the sacred. The hot and cold springs developed into an elaborate bathing complex serve simultaneously hygienic, therapeutic, social, and religious functions. The separation of bathing facilities by social category, distinct baths for kings, citizens, women, horses, and other animals, creates a hydraulic social hierarchy mapping class structure onto water distribution. Access to water becomes a social marker. The quality, temperature, and location of one's bath communicates social position with the same precision as clothing or housing. This hydraulic stratification reveals the depth to which hierarchical thinking penetrates Atlantean culture. Even the most basic biological necessity is organized according to principles of social rank. The groves and gardens surrounding the bathing complex create a sacred landscape mediating between the temple precinct's architectural formality and the outer ring's agricultural productivity. These groves function as a paradise garden, a cultivated space combining natural beauty with human artifice to create an environment surpassing both wild nature and urban construction. In the Atlantean context, this paradise garden serves as visible evidence of Poseidon's continuing blessing, a living demonstration that divine favor continues to sustain the civilization through the fertility of its sacred landscape. The bridges and tunnels connecting the concentric rings represent engineering achievements, transforming Poseidon's natural defensive barriers into functional urban infrastructure. The bridges accommodate vehicular traffic. The tunnels allow passage of triremes, warships requiring channels of considerable depth and width. This dual-mode transportation system creates three-dimensional urban infrastructure operating on multiple levels simultaneously. The stone used in construction, quarried in three colors, white, black, and red, introduces chromatic symbolism into the built environment, complementing the temple's metallic symbolism, creating a geological palette whose aesthetic effect communicates the island's volcanic nature, while demonstrating human capacity to transform raw geological material into ordered architectural form. The harbor system of Atlantis represents the civilization's interface with the external world, the point at which internal sacred order meets external commercial and military reality. The outermost ring of water, connected to the open sea by a canal large enough to admit the largest ships, functions as the primary commercial harbor, receiving merchant vessels from across the known world. This harbor's position on the outermost ring ensures that foreign commerce, with its attendant cultural contamination, its introduction of alien values and practices, is kept at maximum distance from the sacred center. The spatial organization of commercial activity thus reflects a theology of purity. The profane business of trade is confined to the periphery, prevented by concentric barriers of water and land from penetrating to the sacred core where divine presence dwells. The canal connecting the harbor to the sea, described as 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and 50 stadia long, represents an engineering achievement whose scale challenges the limits of ancient technological capability. These dimensions create a waterway comparable to modern ship canals, capable of accommodating not merely individual vessels, but entire fleets simultaneously. The canal's depth of 100 feet far exceeds the draft of any ancient vessel, suggesting that its dimensions were determined not by practical necessity, but by symbolic ambition, the desire to create an infrastructure whose scale communicates the civilization's power and wealth to every approaching vessel. The canal is therefore not merely a transportation corridor, but a monumental entrance, a processional waterway whose dimensions announce the magnitude of the civilization that constructed it. The inner harbors, occupying the second and third rings of water, serve increasingly specialized functions as one moves toward the center. The second ring accommodates military vessels, triremes, and their associated infrastructure of dockyards, arsenals, and training facilities. The third ring, closest to the central island, serves the royal household and the temple complex, receiving only those vessels authorized to approach the sacred center. This graduated system of harbor access creates a naval hierarchy that mirrors the social hierarchy of the civilization, Commercial vessels are confined to the outer ring, military vessels to the middle ring, and royal sacred vessels to the inner ring. Each transition from outer to inner harbor requires passage through a controlled gateway, a bridge or tunnel, whose guardians regulate access according to the traveler's status and purpose. The dockyards carved into the rock of the ring islands represent a fusion of natural geology and human engineering that characterizes Atlantean infrastructure. Rather than constructing freestanding buildings on the ring surfaces, the Atlanteans excavated their dockyards directly into the living rock, creating covered facilities that are simultaneously architectural spaces and geological formations. This technique, which anticipates the rock-cut architecture of Petra, Lalibela, and other historical sites, demonstrates an approach to construction that works with, rather than against, natural materials, transforming the island's geological structure into functional infrastructure without imposing alien forms upon it. The palace complex occupying the central island evolves over generations as successive kings add to and embellish the structures inherited from their predecessors. This cumulative construction process creates an architectural palimpsest, a layered structure in which each generation's contributions are superimposed upon those of previous generations, producing a building that encodes the entire history of the dynasty in its physical fabric. Each king, Kleito tells us, sought to surpass his predecessor in the magnificence of his additions, creating a competitive dynamic that drove architectural innovation while simultaneously expressing the dynasty's increasing wealth and power. This competitive embellishment is both a strength and a vulnerability. It produces architectural magnificence, but also introduces a psychology of excess, a compulsion to surpass that, when transferred from architecture to other domains, becomes the plenexia, insatiable desire for more, that ultimately destroys the civilization. The palace's relationship to the temple creates a spatial dialectic between political and religious authority that defines the governance structure of the central island. The temple, as the dwelling place of Poseidon's image and the repository of the constitutional inscriptions, represents divine authority, the ultimate source of political legitimacy. The palace, as the residence of the ruling king and the administrative center of the empire, represents human authority, the practical exercise of political power. The proximity of these two structures, both located on the central island, separated by only a short distance, ensures that political power remains constantly aware of its divine source and divine constraints. The king cannot exercise authority without being reminded, by the physical presence of the temple, that his power derives from and is limited by divine law. The wall system surrounding the central island and the ring islands creates a layered defensive architecture whose materials escalate in value as one approaches the center. The outermost wall is coated with brass, the second with tin, and the innermost, surrounding the Acropolis itself, with orichalcum. This escalating material value creates a defensive hierarchy that is simultaneously military and symbolic. Each wall represents a higher level of protection and a higher level of sacrality, so that penetrating the defenses requires not merely military force, but a progressive violation of increasingly sacred boundaries. An invader who breaches the outer wall has committed a military offense. One who breaches the inner wall has committed a sacrilege. The defensive architecture thus transforms military aggression into theological transgression, raising the psychological cost of attack beyond the merely strategic. The overall spatial organization of the capital, concentric rings radiating outward from a sacred center, with functions arranged hierarchically from most sacred, temple, to most profane, commercial harbor, creates an urban form that is simultaneously a political diagram, a theological statement, and a cosmological model. The city does not merely house the civilization's activities, it organizes them according to principles that reflect the civilization's deepest beliefs about the structure of reality. To live in Atlantis is to inhabit a built environment that constantly communicates the relationship between divine and human, sacred and profane, center and periphery. A city that teaches its inhabitants their place in the cosmic order through the daily experience of navigating its concentric spaces. The great rectangular plain surrounding the capital city, measuring 3,000 by 2,000 stadia, constitutes the agricultural foundation upon which the entire Atlantean civilization rests. This plain, described as the product of both natural fertility and generations of human engineering, represents the material base that makes possible the civilization's military power, architectural magnificence, and political complexity. Without the plain's extraordinary productivity, the elaborate superstructure of Atlantean civilization, its temples, harbors, palaces, and armies, would lack the economic foundation necessary for their creation and maintenance. The plain's dimensions, approximately 345 by 230 miles in modern measurement, create an agricultural zone of roughly 79,000 square miles, an area exceeding the total territory of many modern nations. This scale is not merely impressive but philosophically necessary. It establishes an agricultural base capable of supporting the enormous military establishment that Plato subsequently describes, while simultaneously demonstrating the principle that civilizational power ultimately rests on agricultural productivity. The Atlantean military does not exist in an economic vacuum. It is sustained by a specific agricultural system whose organization and productivity determine the limits of military capability. The canal system irrigating the plain represents hydraulic engineering on a scale that challenges comparison with any historical achievement. The Great Perimeter Canal, 10,000 stadia in total length, 100 feet deep, and 1 stade wide, creates a rectangular water boundary enclosing the entire plain. From this perimeter canal, straight channels run at regular intervals across the plain, connecting to the sea and to each other through a network of cross-channels that creates a grid system of water management covering the entire agricultural zone. This grid system serves multiple functions simultaneously: irrigation, distributing water to every portion of the plain; transportation, allowing the movement of agricultural products by boat; drainage, preventing waterlogging during the rainy season; and defense, creating water barriers that impede the movement of hostile forces across the plain. The division of the plain into 60,000 lots, each measuring 10 by 10 stadia, creates an administrative grid that overlays the hydraulic grid, producing a dual coordinate system in which every point on the plain can be identified by both its hydraulic position, which canal segment serves it, and its administrative position, which lot it belongs to. This dual coordinate system represents a level of territorial organization that anticipates modern cadastral systems, enabling precise administration of land use, taxation, and military conscription across an enormous area. Each lot is assigned a specific military obligation, providing a designated number of soldiers, chariots, horses, and ships, creating a direct link between agricultural production and military capability that ensures the civilization's defensive capacity scales proportionally with its economic base. The crops produced on the plain, including grain, vegetables, fruits, and timber, reflect the Mediterranean agricultural regime familiar to Plato's audience, but amplified to a scale that transforms quantity into quality. The plain produces not merely enough food to sustain the population, but a surplus so vast that it supports the enormous non-productive population required by the civilization's military, religious, and administrative establishments. This surplus is the economic engine of Atlantean civilization, the material foundation that makes possible the specialization of labor, the accumulation of wealth, and the development of the complex institutional structures that characterize advanced civilizations. The 2 annual harvests, one rain-fed in winter, one irrigated in summer, demonstrate the plain's capacity to transcend the normal limitations of Mediterranean agriculture through hydraulic engineering. Most Mediterranean agricultural zones produce only one harvest per year, constrained by the seasonal pattern of winter rainfall and summer drought. The Atlantean canal system overcomes this constraint by providing irrigation water during the dry season, effectively doubling the plain's productive capacity. This technological triumph over natural limitation represents a crucial moment in the civilization's relationship with its environment, the point at which human engineering begins to reshape natural conditions rather than merely adapting to them. This capacity to override natural constraints through technology is both the source of the civilization's extraordinary prosperity and the beginning of its psychological separation from the natural order, a separation that will eventually contribute to the moral corruption that destroys it. The forests that originally covered portions of the plain, providing timber for construction and shipbuilding, represent a natural resource whose exploitation follows a trajectory familiar from the environmental history of actual Mediterranean civilizations. Plato's mention that the island's forests were sufficient to support enormous construction projects implies a timber resource of continental scale, but the very mention of this resource raises the question of its sustainability. Historical Mediterranean civilizations, including classical Athens, experienced significant deforestation as a consequence of naval construction, urban building, and agricultural expansion, and the Atlantean civilization's enormous appetite for timber, for its fleet of 1,200 warships alone, would have placed extraordinary pressure on its forest resources. The relationship between the plain and the capital city creates an economic geography in which agricultural periphery sustains urban center, a spatial arrangement that mirrors the political relationship between subject territory and ruling metropolis. The plain's products flow inward toward the capital through the canal system, feeding the urban population and supplying the raw materials for the city's industries. This centripetal flow of resources creates an economic dependency that reinforces the political hierarchy. The capital's magnificence depends on the plain's productivity, and the plain's organization depends on the capital's administrative authority. This mutual dependency, when functioning properly, creates a stable equilibrium. When disrupted by corruption, mismanagement, or environmental degradation, it creates a cascading failure in which economic collapse triggers political disintegration. The military establishment of Atlantis, as Plato describes it, represents the most detailed account of a fictional military system in ancient literature, a comprehensive order of battle that specifies unit types, equipment, organization, and numerical strength, with a precision that invites comparison with actual ancient military establishments. This precision serves a dual function. It creates an impression of historical authenticity that supports the narrative's claim to factual basis, while simultaneously constructing a military system whose characteristics illuminate the political and moral condition of the civilization that maintains it. The core of the Atlantean military is the chariot force, 10,000 chariots drawn from the 60,000 lots of the Great Plain, each lot contributing 1/6 of a chariot, with its associated crew and equipment. This chariot-based military reflects an archaic mode of warfare that, by Plato's time, had been largely superseded by infantry-based tactics in the Greek world. The choice of chariots as the primary military arm is therefore historically significant, positions Atlantis in a military technological era that predates the Hoplite Revolution, connecting the civilization to the heroic age of Homeric warfare rather than the classical age of phalanx combat. This temporal positioning reinforces the narrative's claim to extreme antiquity, while simultaneously suggesting that Atlantean military doctrine, like Atlantean moral character, belongs to an earlier and perhaps more primitive stage of civilizational development. The naval force, 1,200 warships, represents a fleet of extraordinary size that exceeds the combined naval strength of any historical Mediterranean power. For comparison, the Athenian fleet at its peak numbered approximately 300 triremes, and the combined Greek fleet at Salamis numbered roughly 370 ships. The Atlantean fleet of 1,200 warships therefore represents a naval capability approximately 3 to 4 times greater than the largest historical Mediterranean fleet, a scale that transforms naval power from a strategic asset into an instrument of continental domination. A fleet of this size could simultaneously project power across the entire Mediterranean basin, maintaining permanent naval superiority in multiple theaters of operation. The infantry component, including heavy infantry, archers, slingers, stone throwers, and javelin men, creates a combined arms force capable of engaging enemies across the full spectrum of ancient combat. The inclusion of light infantry types, archers, slingers, javelin men, alongside heavy infantry reflects a tactical sophistication that recognizes the limitations of any single troop type and seeks to create a force whose components complement each other's strengths and compensate for each other's weaknesses. This combined arms approach anticipates the military reforms of Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander, who created the most effective combined arms force in the ancient world by integrating heavy infantry, the Macedonian phalanx, light infantry, cavalry, and siege engineers into a single tactical system. The military obligation system, in which each lot on the Great Plain is required to provide a specified contribution of men, equipment, and supplies, creates a direct link between land ownership and military service that mirrors the citizen-soldier model of Greek city-states while operating at a vastly larger scale. This system ensures that military capability scales proportionally with agricultural productivity. As the plane's output increases, so does the military establishment it supports. The system also distributes the burden of military service across the entire agricultural population, preventing the concentration of military power in the hands of a professional warrior class that might challenge the authority of the royal government. The command structure, with each of the 10 kings exercising supreme military authority within his own territory, while subordinating himself to Atlas's overall command in matters of federal defense, creates a military hierarchy that mirrors the political hierarchy of the federal system. This dual command structure carries inherent risks. It ensures broad participation in military decision-making, but also creates potential for conflicting orders, divided loyalties, and strategic incoherence when the 10 kingdoms must coordinate their forces for combined operations. The constitutional prohibition against interroyal warfare mitigates these risks by eliminating the possibility of military conflict among the constituent kingdoms, but it cannot eliminate the more subtle problems of coordination, communication, and strategic alignment that plague all federal military systems. The geographical scope of Atlantean military operations. Plato mentions that Atlantis controlled territory extending to Libya as far as Egypt and to Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, modern Tuscany, reveals an imperial ambition of continental proportions. This territorial extent creates military commitments that strain even the enormous resources of the Atlantean state, requiring the maintenance of garrison forces across a vast area, while simultaneously maintaining the naval capability to project power across the Mediterranean. The overextension implicit in this territorial scope anticipates the strategic dilemma that would later confront actual Mediterranean empires, the Roman Empire most notably, in which the costs of defending an ever-expanding frontier eventually exceed the economic capacity of the imperial core. The relationship between military power and moral condition constitutes the narrative's most important military philosophical insight. The Atlantean military is not merely a tool of state policy, but an expression of the civilization's moral character. And as that character degrades, the military's function transforms from defensive protection to aggressive expansion. The early Atlantean military, maintained by a virtuous civilization, serves primarily defensive purposes, protecting the island and its dependencies from external threats. The later Atlantean military, maintained by a corrupted civilization, serves aggressive purposes, projecting power outward in pursuit of conquest and domination. This transformation of military function from defensive to offensive mirrors the internal transformation of the civilization from virtue to vice, creating a feedback loop in which military success reinforces the moral corruption that drives aggressive expansion. The ultimate military failure of Atlantis, its defeat by the much smaller Athenian force, demonstrates the Platonic principle that virtue is a more reliable foundation for military effectiveness than material superiority. The Athenians, fighting with inferior numbers and resources but superior moral character, defeat the Atlanteans precisely because their virtue produces the qualities that matter most in combat: courage, discipline, cohesion, and willingness to sacrifice individual interest for collective survival. The Atlanteans, despite their overwhelming material advantages, lack these qualities because their moral corruption has eroded the psychological foundations of military effectiveness. Their soldiers fight for plunder rather than principle. Their commanders pursue personal glory rather than strategic objectives, and their political leaders lack the moral authority to demand the sacrifices that military necessity requires. The legal system of Atlantis, as Plato describes it, operates at the intersection of divine law and human administration, a system in which the fundamental principles of justice are divinely ordained and inscribed on sacred materials, while their application to specific cases is delegated to human rulers operating within divinely established constraints. This dual structure, divine legislation and human adjudication, creates a legal system whose authority derives from a source beyond human manipulation, while whose practical operation requires human judgment and interpretation. The tension between these two elements, the fixity of divine law and the flexibility of human application, constitutes the central dynamic of Atlantean jurisprudence. The Orichalcum pillar in the Temple of Poseidon, on which the fundamental laws are inscribed, functions as the constitutional foundation of the entire legal system, the fixed point from which all legal authority derives and to which all legal disputes are ultimately referred. The choice of Orichalcum as the medium of inscription is legally significant. As the rarest and most sacred material in the Atlantean world, it communicates the supreme importance of the inscribed laws while simultaneously protecting them from casual alteration. Unlike papyrus or wooden tablets, which can be easily modified or destroyed, a metal pillar resists tampering with a physical stubbornness that mirrors the legal stubbornness of the principles it bears. The medium is the message. The immutability of the inscription material communicates the immutability of the inscribed laws. The content of the inscribed laws, which Plato describes only in general terms, includes the prohibition against interroyal warfare, the requirement of mutual assistance among the 10 kingdoms, the procedures for collective deliberation and judgment, and the overarching principle that no king may put any of his kinsmen to death without the consent of the majority of the 10. This last provision is particularly significant. It creates a collective check on royal power that prevents any single king from using capital punishment as a tool of political elimination. The requirement of majority consent transforms the death penalty from an instrument of individual royal authority into a collective federal decision, ensuring that the most extreme exercise of state power is subject to the broadest possible deliberation. The periodic judicial assemblies, held alternately every 5 and 6 years, creating a cycle that allegories the even and the odd, introduce a mathematical principle into the temporal organization of justice that connects legal procedure to cosmological order. The alternation between 5-year and 6-year intervals creates an 11-year cycle whose astronomical significance, the approximate period of the solar sunspot cycle, though Plato could not have known this, may reflect an intuitive recognition of cosmic periodicities that govern terrestrial affairs. More immediately, the alternation between even and odd intervals ensures that the judicial assemblies do not fall into a rigid temporal pattern that might be exploited by those seeking to manipulate the timing of legal proceedings for political advantage. The judicial procedure itself, beginning with the bull sacrifice, continuing through the oath-taking ceremony, and culminating in the deliberation and judgment of pending cases, fuses religious ritual with legal process to a degree that makes their separation impossible. The judges, the 10 kings, approach their judicial function not as secular magistrates, but as sacred officiants, priests of justice whose authority derives from their divine lineage, and whose judgments carry the weight of divine sanction. This fusion of judicial and priestly roles ensures that legal proceedings are conducted with the solemnity and gravity appropriate to acts that affect not merely the parties involved, but the cosmic order that the legal system is designed to maintain. The requirement that judgments be inscribed on golden tablets and deposited in the temple creates a permanent record of judicial decisions that serves multiple functions. It preserves precedent for future reference. It creates accountability by making judicial decisions publicly accessible, and it places the record of human justice within the sacred space of divine authority, symbolically subordinating human judgment to divine law. The golden tablets, accumulating over generations, create an expanding archive of applied justice that supplements the fixed principles of the Orichalcum pillar with the evolving body of case law that their application generates. The principle of collective responsibility that pervades the Atlantean legal system, the idea that each king is responsible not only for justice within his own territory, but for the maintenance of justice across the entire federation, creates a system of mutual accountability that prevents any single kingdom from becoming a haven for injustice. If one king fails to maintain legal standards within his territory, the other 9 are obligated to intervene, not as conquerors, but as co-guardians of the divine legal order. This principle of collective responsibility transforms the Federation from a mere alliance of convenience into a moral community bound by shared commitment to justice, a community in which each member's failure is every member's concern. The relationship between the legal system and the moral decline of the civilization reveals the fundamental limitation of institutional solutions to moral problems. The Atlantean legal system is, by any standard, extraordinarily well designed. It combines divine authority with human flexibility, fixed principles with evolving application, individual accountability with collective responsibility. Yet this sophisticated legal architecture proves ultimately incapable of preventing the moral corruption that destroys the civilization. The laws remain inscribed on the Orichalcum pillar, unchanged and unchangeable. But the kings who interpret and apply those laws gradually lose the moral capacity to do so faithfully. The legal system's failure is not structural but moral. not a failure of institutional design, but a failure of the human character that the institutions were designed to channel and constrain. This insight, that legal institutions cannot substitute for moral character, constitutes one of the most important political philosophical lessons of the Atlantis narrative. It challenges the institutional optimism that characterizes much political theory, both ancient and modern, the belief that properly designed institutions can produce just outcomes regardless of the moral quality of the individuals who operate them. The Atlantean example demonstrates that institutions, however well designed, are only as good as the people who inhabit them. That legal structures can channel and constrain human behavior, but cannot generate the moral commitment that makes just behavior possible. Without virtue, the most sophisticated legal system becomes an empty formalism, a set of procedures that produces the appearance of justice while permitting the reality of corruption. The moral decline of Atlantis, the progressive transformation of a divinely blessed civilization from virtue to vice, constitutes the narrative's psychological and philosophical core, the process whose analysis gives the entire account its enduring significance. Plato's description of this decline is remarkable for its precision and its modernity. It identifies specific psychological mechanisms, traces their operation across generations, and demonstrates how individual moral failures aggregate into civilizational catastrophe. The decline is not sudden but gradual, not dramatic but insidious, a slow erosion of moral capacity that proceeds imperceptibly across generations, driven by forces that the declining civilization cannot perceive, because the decline itself degrades the perceptual faculties necessary for its recognition. The biological mechanism that Plato identifies as the primary driver of decline, the progressive dilution of divine blood through successive generations of intermarriage with mortals, provides a naturalistic explanation for moral degradation that operates independently of individual choice. Each generation of Atlantean rulers possesses a slightly lower proportion of divine blood than its predecessor, and this diminishing divine element produces a corresponding diminution of moral capacity, a reduced ability to perceive the good, to resist temptation, and to prioritize virtue over pleasure. This biological determinism sits uncomfortably with the moral responsibility that the narrative simultaneously assigns to the declining rulers, creating a tension between nature and choice that Plato does not fully resolve, and that may be deliberately irresolvable, reflecting the genuine complexity of the relationship between constitutional predisposition and moral agency. The psychological progression of the decline follows a specific sequence that Plato traces with clinical precision. The first stage is the loss of moral perception, the inability to recognize virtue as the highest good. The early Atlanteans, with their high proportion of divine blood, perceived virtue clearly and valued it above all material goods. The later Atlanteans, with their diminished divine element, gradually lose this perception, coming to see material wealth and power as goods equal to or greater than virtue. This perceptual shift is the foundational corruption from which all subsequent moral failures derive. Once virtue is no longer perceived as the supreme good, the psychological motivation for virtuous behavior is undermined, and the pursuit of material goods becomes increasingly dominant. The second stage is the development of plenexia, the insatiable desire for more that Plato identifies throughout his works as the root of all political corruption. Plenexia is not merely greed in the ordinary sense. It is a structural feature of the corrupted psyche, a permanent orientation toward acquisition that can never be satisfied because its object is not any specific good, but the act of acquisition itself. The pleonexic individual does not want wealth in order to achieve some further purpose. He wants wealth because wanting wealth has become the organizing principle of his psychological life. This distinction between instrumental and constitutive desire is crucial. Instrumental desire can be satisfied. One acquires the desired object and the desire ceases. But constitutive desire cannot be satisfied because it is not directed toward any specific object but toward the perpetual expansion of possession. The third stage is the externalization of value, the transfer of worth from internal qualities, virtue, wisdom, temperance, to external possessions, wealth, power, status. This transfer transforms the civilization's value system from one that rewards moral excellence to one that rewards material accumulation, creating incentive structures that systematically favor vice over virtue. The individual who pursues wealth at the expense of justice is rewarded with social prestige and political influence. The individual who pursues justice at the expense of wealth is marginalized and ignored. Over time, this incentive structure produces a ruling class that is selected for acquisitiveness rather than virtue, a class whose members have risen to power precisely because they possess the qualities that the civilization's corrupted value system rewards. The fourth stage is the normalization of corruption, the point at which corrupt behavior becomes so widespread that it ceases to be perceived as corrupt. When every ruler is engaged in self-enrichment, when every political decision is influenced by material interest, when every social interaction is mediated by calculations of advantage, corruption becomes the background condition of civilizational life, invisible because ubiquitous, unquestioned because universal. This normalization is the most dangerous stage of the decline because it eliminates the possibility of internal reform. A civilization that cannot perceive its own corruption cannot correct it, because correction requires the recognition that something has gone wrong. And this recognition is precisely what the normalization of corruption prevents. The fifth and final stage is the loss of shame, the disappearance of the psychological mechanism that, in healthy individuals and civilizations, produces discomfort in the presence of moral failure. Plato describes the corrupted Atlanteans as unable to perceive their own degradation. They appear glorious and blessed to those who share their corruption, while appearing base to those who retain the capacity for moral perception. This divergence between internal and external perception reveals the epistemological dimension of moral corruption. The corrupted individual not only acts badly but perceives badly, mistaking vice for virtue and degradation for flourishing. The loss of shame is therefore not merely a moral failure but a cognitive failure, a breakdown of the perceptual apparatus that enables accurate moral judgment. The intergenerational transmission of corruption, the process by which each generation's moral failures become the next generation's moral norms, creates a ratchet effect that makes decline self-reinforcing and self-accelerating. Each generation inherits a moral baseline that is slightly lower than its predecessors, and from this lowered baseline, it makes its own moral compromises, producing a new baseline that is lower still. This ratchet effect ensures that the decline, once initiated, proceeds with increasing momentum. Each generation falls further and faster than the last, because each generation begins from a lower starting point and possesses fewer moral resources with which to resist the downward pressure. The collective dimension of the decline, the way in which individual moral failures aggregate into civilizational transformation, reveals the emergent properties of moral systems that cannot be predicted from the analysis of individual behavior alone. No single Atlantean ruler decides to destroy the civilization. Each merely makes small compromises that, individually, seem insignificant but that, collectively, produce catastrophic consequences. This gap between individual intention and collective outcome is one of the most important insights of the Atlantis narrative. It demonstrates that civilizational decline does not require villains. It requires only ordinary individuals making ordinary compromises in an environment that systematically rewards vice and penalizes virtue. The relationship between prosperity and corruption that the narrative establishes challenges the intuitive assumption that material abundance promotes moral development. The Atlantean example demonstrates precisely the opposite. Material abundance, beyond a certain threshold, actively undermines moral development by eliminating the conditions of scarcity and struggle that historically have been the primary stimuli for the development of virtue. Courage develops in the face of danger. Temperance develops in the face of temptation. Justice develops in the face of conflict. When danger, temptation, and conflict are eliminated by overwhelming material abundance, the virtues they stimulate atrophy from disuse, leaving the civilization psychologically defenseless against the moral challenges that abundance itself generates. The divine judgment concluding the Atlantis narrative, Zeus's decision to punish the corrupted civilization, represents the theological culmination of the entire account, the moment at which cosmic order reasserts itself against accumulated moral disorder. Plato's description is remarkably compressed, occupying only a few sentences before the dialogue breaks off. Yet within this compressed account lies a theology of divine justice, addressing fundamental questions about the relationship between divine power and human freedom, between cosmic order and civilizational autonomy, between punishment and correction. The trigger for divine intervention is described with philosophical precision. Zeus perceived that an honorable race was in a woeful plight, and wanting to inflict punishment on them that they might be chastened and improve. This formulation reveals crucial aspects of Platonic judgment theology. First, the object of Zeus's concern is not specific acts of corruption but the Atlanteans' condition, their state of moral degradation. Divine judgment responds not to individual transgressions, but to systemic moral failure, not to what the Atlanteans have done, but to what they have become. This distinction between act-based and condition-based judgment carries profound implications. Divine justice operates at a level deeper than human legal categories, addressing root causes rather than surface manifestations. Second, the stated purpose is correction, not retribution. Zeus wants the Atlanteans chastened and improved, not destroyed. This corrective intention transforms divine judgment from vengeance into pedagogy, a severe lesson administered by a cosmic teacher to students who have strayed too far from virtue's curriculum. The language of chastening implies the Atlanteans retain capacity for moral improvement, that their corruption has not entirely extinguished the divine element in their nature. Third, Zeus initiates the judgment rather than Poseidon, the god who created Atlantis and fathered its royal line. This transfer of judicial authority from patron deity to supreme deity suggests the corruption has transcended local jurisdiction. The moral failure threatens not merely Poseidon's domain, but the cosmic order Zeus maintains. The corruption is not a local problem but a cosmic one. The convening of the divine assembly, Zeus gathering all the gods into their most holy habitation, which, being placed in the center of the world, beholds all created things, introduces spatial theology, paralleling Atlantis's concentric geography. Just as Poseidon's temple occupied the island's sacred center, the divine habitation occupies the cosmos's sacred center. This parallel reinforces the analogical relationship between human and divine governance. When the human order fails, the cosmic order must intervene to restore correspondence. The divine habitation as a place beholding all created things introduces divine omniscience, not passive observation but active moral perception, the ability to see not just what happens, but what it means. When Zeus looks upon Atlantis, he sees not magnificent buildings, and powerful military, but the moral reality behind material appearances, the corruption these achievements simultaneously express and conceal. The speech Zeus delivers to the assembled gods, whose content Plato's text breaks off before revealing, represents perhaps the most tantalizing lacuna in the entire Platonic corpus. The absence forces readers to construct their own theology of divine judgment, drawing on principles established throughout the narrative. This forced construction is itself a philosophical exercise, an invitation to think through implications rather than receive authoritative pronouncement. The theological framework differs significantly from the Judeo-Christian model. In the Platonic model, divine judgment is not motivated by personal offense. Zeus is not angry in the way Genesis's God is angry at Babel's builders. Rather, Zeus acts from concern for cosmic order, maintaining the moral structure of the universe. This impersonal quality makes Platonic divine justice simultaneously more rational and more terrifying. It operates with the inevitability of natural law, eliminating any possibility of appeal, negotiation, or mercy. The form of punishment, submersion beneath the sea in a single day and night, carries its own theological significance. Submersion by water is not merely destruction but purification, washing away corruption, returning polluted land to primordial oceanic formlessness. Water, as Poseidon's element, serves as the instrument of judgment, creating poetic justice. The god's domain reclaims territory his descendants defiled. The totality of destruction, complete disappearance leaving no trace, ensures the lesson is purely moral. There is nothing to salvage, rebuild, or inherit. The only legacy is the story itself, carrying only moral content stripped of material residue. The simultaneous destruction of the virtuous Athenian army introduces a troubling complication. If Atlantis's destruction was punishment for corruption, what was Athens's destruction? The most philosophically satisfying interpretation is that destroying both civilizations simultaneously prevented virtuous Athenians from inheriting corrupt Atlantean wealth, which might have corrupted them in turn. The gods ensured a clean break, a complete reset preventing corruption's transmission through material inheritance. The concept of divine patience, gods tolerating corruption for multiple generations before intervening, suggests the threshold is reached not when corruption first appears, but when it becomes irreversible, when the civilization has lost internal capacity for self-correction. The generations of gradual decline represent divine forbearance, during which the gods presumably hoped the Atlanteans would self-correct. Only when this hope was exhausted did Zeus authorize catastrophic intervention. The question of whether the Atlanteans could have avoided their fate is perhaps the most philosophically significant question the narrative raises. If decline was biologically determined, the Atlanteans were not morally responsible, and their punishment was unjust. If freely chosen, they were fully responsible, and punishment was deserved. Plato occupies an uncomfortable middle ground. Biological dilution created predisposition toward corruption, but actual corruption required the cooperation of individual will. This position, moral responsibility attenuated but not eliminated by constitutional factors, anticipates modern debates about biological predisposition and moral agency with remarkable sophistication. The cosmic scale of punishment communicates a theology of proportionality, operating differently from human conceptions. The scale matches not the severity of individual offenses, but the gap between what the Atlanteans were given and what they became. A civilization falling from the greatest heights deserves the most catastrophic punishment, not because its individual acts are worse, but because its failure to maintain virtue despite every advantage represents a more profound betrayal of cosmic moral order. The Atlantis narrative occupies a unique and deeply problematic position within Plato's epistemological framework. The fundamental question is deceptively simple. What kind of knowledge does the Atlantis story represent? Is it history, myth, allegory, thought experiment, or some hybrid category resisting classification? Plato's own signals are deliberately ambiguous, creating a hermeneutic puzzle functioning as a philosophical exercise, an invitation to reflect on the nature of narrative knowledge and its relationship to more rigorous forms of knowing. The framing as historical fact, transmitted from Egyptian priests to Solon, from Solon to Critias the Elder, from Critias the Elder to Critias the Younger, establishes a chain of testimony mimicking genuine historical transmission. Each link is a named individual with plausible historical identity. This chain creates an appearance of historical credibility, distinguishing the Atlantis narrative from openly mythological stories Plato tells elsewhere. The cave, the chariot, the allegory of Er. The story is presented not as philosophical invention, but as historical report. Yet the content, divine founder, impossible geography, mythological materials, catastrophic destruction leaving no trace, resists historical interpretation with equal force. No geological evidence supports a large Atlantic island sinking in historical times. No archaeological evidence confirms a matching civilization. The tension between historical framing and mythological content creates epistemological instability that Plato cultivated deliberately. A narrative simultaneously claiming truth and presenting itself in terms making literal truth impossible. This instability serves a philosophical function connecting to Plato's broader epistemological project, the distinction between knowledge, episteme, and opinion, doxa. The narrative forces the reader to confront this distinction directly. A reader accepting it as literal history operates at the level of doxa, accepting claims on testimonial authority without rational scrutiny. A reader dismissing it as pure fiction also operates at doxa, rejecting claims on surface implausibility without investigating deeper content. Only a reader recognizing it as philosophical construction, myth designed to communicate truths transcending literal content, operates at episteme, apprehending the form of truth the narrative imperfectly embodies. The relationship between the Atlantis narrative and the Republic's political philosophy illuminates another dimension. The Timaeus begins with a summary of the Republic's ideal state, and Socrates expresses desire to see this ideal in motion. The Atlantis narrative responds by providing a concrete example. Ancient Athens embodies the virtuous state, Atlantis embodies the corrupted state, and their conflict dramatizes the argument that virtue is ultimately stronger than vice. The narrative functions as applied epistemology, translating abstract principles into concrete narrative form. The Egyptian origin introduces an additional dimension reflecting Greek attitudes toward foreign wisdom. By attributing the story to Egyptian sources, Plato invests it with ancient wisdom's authority, while raising questions about cross-cultural knowledge transmission's reliability. The priests claim that their records preserve knowledge of events 9,000 years prior challenges assumptions about historical memory's limits and the epistemological status of unverifiable claims. The numerical precision, exact dimensions, precise measurements, specific military numbers, creates an appearance of empirical accuracy that paradoxically undermines historical credibility. Genuine historical accounts rarely include such precision. The very precision suggests not historical accuracy, but philosophical construction. The imposition of mathematical order on narrative material for symbolic purposes. The dimensions are not measurements but symbols. The unfinished state of the Critias, breaking off as Zeus is about to speak, carries profound epistemological implications if deliberate. It suggests the full truth of divine judgment is inaccessible to human understanding. The philosopher can trace causes and conditions of decline but cannot penetrate divine decision-making's mystery. The break creates a boundary between human and divine knowledge, a textual enactment of the epistemological limit separating philosophical understanding from theological mystery. The relationship to the Republic's noble lie, Genaion Pseudos, adds another layer. The Atlantis narrative may represent precisely such a noble lie, literally false, no island of Atlantis, but philosophically true. Civilizations abandoning virtue for material excess will be destroyed. If correct, the narrative's epistemological status is neither simply true nor simply false, but occupies a third category. The philosophically instructive fiction communicating truth through invention. This third category has profound implications for the philosophy of narrative. If the Atlantis story can be simultaneously false as history and true as philosophy, the conventional opposition between fact and fiction is revealed as inadequate. Some truths, particularly about moral character, civilizational dynamics, and the relationship between virtue and prosperity, may be more effectively communicated through narrative than argument, more clearly revealed through myth than analysis. The narrative, in its deliberate ambiguity, enacts this epistemological insight, demonstrating through its own form the limitations of the fact-fiction dichotomy. The reception history, the extraordinary range of interpretations generated over 2.5 millennia, itself constitutes evidence for the narrative's epistemological productivity. A text sustaining interpretation as literal history, political allegory, moral fable, cosmological myth, epistemological exercise, and philosophical thought experiment possesses semantic richness exceeding any single interpretive framework. This richness is designed. Plato constructed the narrative with sufficient complexity and ambiguity to support multiple reading levels, ensuring each generation finds relevant meanings. The Atlantis story is a philosophical perpetual motion machine, generating new meaning with each reading, never exhausting interpretive potential because fundamental ambiguity prevents any single interpretation from achieving definitive authority. The chain of transmission through which the Atlantis narrative reaches Plato's readers constitutes one of the most carefully constructed elements of the entire account. A sequence of named narrators, specific historical contexts, and explicit authenticity claims creating a framework of testimonial authority unprecedented in Plato's dialogues. This chain spans approximately 2 centuries and crosses the boundary between two civilizational traditions, Egyptian and Greek, creating a transmission pathway whose complexity simultaneously enhances and undermines the narrative's credibility. The Egyptian priests of Sais occupied the foundational position. Plato's choice reflects complex Greek attitudes toward Egyptian civilization, combining genuine respect for Egyptian antiquity with cultural condescension, coloring Greek interpretations of Egyptian knowledge. The Greeks genuinely believed Egyptian civilization was far older, and that Egyptian temples preserved records predating Greek historical memory by millennia. By grounding the narrative in Egyptian priestly records, Plato taps into this reservoir of cultural authority. The specific claim, records preserving knowledge of events 9,000 years before Solon's visit, approximately 9,600 BCE, pushes the temporal horizon far beyond verifiable historical record. This date places events in the early Holocene, when complex urban societies had not yet developed. The impossibility of this date is precisely what makes it philosophically interesting. It establishes Atlantis as a civilization existing before history, in a temporal realm accessible only through Egyptian institutional memory. This prehistorical positioning removes the narrative from verifiable fact and places it in a liminal zone between history and myth. The Egyptian priest's critique of Greek historical knowledge. Their assertion that the Greeks are always children because periodic catastrophes destroy their records introduces a theory of historical epistemology with profound implications. Historical knowledge is not cumulative but cyclical. Civilizations accumulate knowledge only to lose it in catastrophic events. The Egyptian priesthood, protected by the Nile's unique hydrological regime, maintained continuous records through multiple catastrophic cycles. This theory explains how a civilization as magnificent as Atlantis could have been completely forgotten. Solon's role introduces different epistemological considerations. As one of the 7 sages, he possessed intellectual authority to evaluate the Egyptian account. As a traveler, he had practical opportunity to visit SAIs. Plato's choice is strategically brilliant. Solon is a figure of unimpeachable authority, whose acceptance of the Egyptian account carries enormous testimonial weight. Yet Solon's role introduces a critical vulnerability: translation. The conversation necessarily involved translation between Greek and Egyptian, inevitably introducing distortions and cultural reinterpretations. The names are Greek translations of Egyptian names that were themselves translations of original Atlantean names, a double translation virtually guaranteeing significant semantic drift. The problem extends beyond names to concepts, institutions, and cultural practices. The Atlantis reader's encounter is not the original but one successively Egyptianized and Hellenized, a cultural palimpsest with multiple interpretive layers. Solon's unfulfilled intention to compose a poetic version introduces another complication. Had he completed the poem, the narrative would have entered Greek culture in a form explicitly acknowledging artistic transformation. The fact that he never completed it means the narrative remained informal, a collection of notes and oral accounts lacking definitive literary form. This informality paradoxically enhances historical authenticity claims, no literary artifice, while undermining reliability, no disciplined organization. The transmission from Solon to Critias the Elder, occurring at a family gathering, elderly man to young grandson, introduces intergenerational oral transmission dynamics. Oral transmission across generations is subject to well-documented distortion patterns. Details forgotten, embellished, or reorganized. Narrator's assumptions coloring retelling. Audience expectations shaping material selection. The specific context, elderly man to child, would naturally have simplified complex material and emphasized dramatic elements. Critias the Younger's claim that childhood memories are often more vivid than recent ones reveals sophisticated awareness of memory psychology. However, modern research reveals vivid memories are not necessarily accurate. Subjective certainty does not correlate reliably with objective accuracy. Critias's confidence may be misplaced, and his narrative may contain distortions introduced by decades of memory consolidation that subjective vividness cannot detect. The dramatic context, philosophical conversation among Socrates, Timaeus, Critias, and Hermocrates, introduces a final layer. Critias is not delivering a neutral historical lecture, but participating in a dialogue with specific intellectual objectives. His narrative responds to Socrates' desire to see the ideal state in motion, follows Timaeus's cosmological account, and is intended to demonstrate Athenian political superiority. These contextual pressures inevitably shape content and emphasis, highlighting elements serving the philosophical argument while potentially suppressing complicating elements. The cumulative effect, cultural translation, linguistic transformation, oral distortion, memory reconstruction, rhetorical shaping, creates a narrative whose relationship to any historical original is highly attenuated. Each link introduces characteristic distortions compounding across the chain. Plato's careful construction, with explicit acknowledgement of translation problems and memory limitations, suggests full awareness of these difficulties, included not to undermine credibility but to raise questions about historical knowledge's nature. The institutional dimension, the Egyptian priesthood, as knowledge custodians, raises questions about the relationship between institutional authority and epistemological reliability resonating far beyond Atlantis. The priest's claim rests entirely on institutional authority that cannot be independently verified. Plato thus raises a fundamental question: under what conditions is it rational to accept unverifiable claims, and what role does institutional authority play in establishing credibility? These questions have direct relevance to contemporary debates about scientific institutions, religious traditions, and historical archives. The absence of any surviving Egyptian records corroborating the narrative constitutes the most significant evidentiary challenge. No inscription, papyrus, or temple relief from any Egyptian site mentions Atlantis. This absence can be interpreted multiple ways: as evidence the narrative is fictional, that relevant records were lost, or that Egyptian source material described something quite different from Plato's presentation. Each interpretation carries different implications, and none can be definitively established. The absence is an epistemological void, fillable with almost any hypothesis, a characteristic making the narrative an inexhaustible source of speculation. The self-referential dimension, Plato's text is itself a link in the chain, subject to the same copying, translation, and interpretation processes, adds a final layer. The Critias modern readers encounter is a copy of a copy, transmitted through centuries of scribal reproduction. The text has been translated into dozens of languages, each introducing interpretive choices. The Atlantis narrative existing in contemporary culture is therefore not Plato's narrative, but a cultural construction reflecting interpreters' concerns as much as the author's intentions. The transmission problem transforms from a historical question into a hermeneutical one, not what really happened, but what does this narrative mean, and how has its meaning changed over time? The legacy of the Atlantis narrative extends far beyond Platonic scholarship, reaching into virtually every domain of Western cultural production: literature, art, architecture, political theory, pseudoscience, popular entertainment, and the collective imagination of civilizations that have never read Plato's original text. This extraordinary cultural reach, sustained over 2,000 years and showing no signs of diminishing, testifies to the narrative's capacity to address fundamental human concerns transcending the specific philosophical context in which it was created. The immediate ancient reception established the interpretive poles between which all subsequent discussion has oscillated. Aristotle reportedly dismissed the story as fiction. He who invented it also destroyed it, simultaneously acknowledging literary power and denying historical validity. Crantor reportedly accepted it as historical fact, claiming Egyptian priests confirmed its accuracy. These two positions, philosophical fiction versus historical fact, have defined interpretation boundaries ever since. The ancient Neoplatonists, particularly Proclus, developed a more nuanced approach seeking to transcend the fact-fiction dichotomy. For Proclus, the narrative operated simultaneously on multiple meaning levels: literal, allegorical, anagogical, and cosmological, each accessible to readers at different philosophical development levels. The literal level was most accessible, but least important. The cosmological level was most important, but accessible only to the most advanced minds. This multi-level hermeneutic anticipated modern literary theory's concept of the text as a multi-layered meaning structure, irreducible to any single framework. The Renaissance rediscovery of the complete Platonic corpus through Marsilio Ficino's translations restored the narrative to its full philosophical context, coinciding with the geographical excitement generated by the discovery of the Americas. The existence of a vast western Atlantic landmass, precisely where Plato located Atlantis, seemed to confirm the narrative's historical reality. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, 1627, exploited this geographical resonance to create a utopian vision merging Platonic philosophy with early modern technological optimism. This fusion established a persistent pattern, using the narrative as a screen onto which contemporary hopes and fears could be projected. The 19th century witnessed Atlantology's emergence as pseudo-scholarly inquiry, catalyzed by Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, 1882. Donnelly argued Atlantis was a historical civilization whose destruction was remembered in worldwide flood myths. His work established the template for popular Atlantis literature persisting today: selective citation, creative archaeological interpretation, and speculative reconstruction of a lost origin civilization. Donnelly's Atlantis was not Plato's. It was a 19th century fantasy projected onto a Platonic framework, but its enormous success demonstrated the narrative's capacity to capture public imagination beyond scholarly debate. The 20th century added new dimensions through archaeology, geology, and oceanography. The mid-Atlantic ridge's discovery, continental drift theory, and identification of historical catastrophes, Thera's eruption, Black Sea flooding, post-glacial coastal submersion, provided new interpretive frameworks. Each scientific discovery generated new Atlantis speculation, as enthusiasts identified the latest finding as evidence for Plato's account. This pattern reveals the narrative's extraordinary adaptability, its capacity to absorb new information without ever being definitively confirmed or refuted. The political dimension deserves particular attention. The Atlantis myth has been appropriated by nationalist movements seeking ancient pedigrees, racial theorists identifying Atlantis with a supposed master race, and anti-colonial movements challenging European civilizational superiority claims. The most notorious appropriation occurred in Nazi Germany, where Heinrich Himmler incorporated Atlantis into racial mythology, identifying the lost civilization with a supposed Aryan homeland. This appropriation, while grotesquely distorting Plato's intentions, demonstrates the narrative's vulnerability to ideological capture, its capacity to be stripped of original philosophical content and refilled with whatever meaning the appropriator wishes. The environmental dimension has become increasingly prominent as the narrative's central theme. Destruction of a civilization failing to maintain sustainable relationship with its heritage resonates with concerns about climate change and ecological degradation. The image of a magnificent city sinking beneath waves has become a powerful symbol of environmental catastrophe, invoked in discussions of sea level rise and coastal flooding. This environmental reading departs significantly from Plato's moral framework, but demonstrates the narrative's capacity to generate new meanings in response to new cultural concerns. The technological dimension reflects contemporary anxieties about the relationship between technological capability and moral wisdom. The Atlantean civilization possessed capabilities far exceeding contemporaries: advanced metallurgy, monumental architecture, sophisticated hydraulic engineering, continental-scale military-industrial complex. Yet these achievements could not prevent moral decline or ultimate destruction. This disconnect resonates powerfully with concerns about artificial intelligence, nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, and other technologies whose harm potential may exceed the moral capacity of creating civilizations. The narrative becomes a cautionary tale, The ability to do something does not imply the wisdom to do it responsibly. The psychological dimension, appeal to deep-seated desires for lost paradises, hidden knowledge, and civilizational origins, connects the narrative to archetypal patterns transcending specific cultural context. The lost Golden Age idea appears in virtually every human culture. The Atlantis narrative taps into this universal archetype, while giving it specifically philosophical inflection. The lost paradise is not merely abundance and harmony, but extraordinary intellectual and political achievement. A society realizing the philosopher's dream of governance by wisdom before succumbing to corruption. This philosophical inflection distinguishes the Atlantis myth from simpler paradise myths, and accounts for its particular appeal to intellectually oriented audiences. The mirror function, reflecting back to each civilization its own anxieties and aspirations, constitutes perhaps the most enduring legacy. Every civilization encountering the story sees its own condition reflected, its prosperity, technological achievements, moral uncertainties, and fears of catastrophic destruction. Romans saw warning about imperial overreach. Renaissance humanists saw civilizational achievement. Enlightenment rationalists saw cautionary tale about tyranny. Romantics saw lost natural harmony. Victorians saw imperial ambition validation. Moderns see environmental catastrophe and technological hubris warning. Each reading simultaneously reads Atlantis and the reading civilization. A double reflection where ancient narrative and contemporary culture illuminate each other. This mirror function ensures permanent cultural relevance, as long as civilizations grapple with the fundamental tensions the narrative dramatizes: material prosperity versus moral virtue, technological capability versus ethical wisdom, individual ambition versus collective responsibility, human freedom versus cosmic order. These tensions are structurally inherent in the human condition, arising whenever human beings organize into complex societies and accumulate resources, making civilization possible. The warning function operates through a mechanism simultaneously simple and profound. The simplicity, civilizations abandoning virtue for material excess, will be destroyed. The profundity, this abandonment is not conscious choice but gradual process. Slow erosion proceeding imperceptibly through generations until the accumulated deviation becomes irreversible. No single Atlantean king decided to become corrupt, each merely relaxed standards fractionally below those inherited, and the cumulative drift across 10 generations produced a civilization unrecognizable to its founders. This is the mechanism Plato isolates as the most dangerous feature of moral decline: its invisibility to those experiencing it. Each generation perceives itself as essentially continuous with its predecessors, unaware that the baseline against which it measures normalcy has itself shifted. The warning, therefore, is not against dramatic acts of evil, but against the tolerance of incremental mediocrity, the slow replacement of divine standards with human convenience. The mirror function adds a reflexive dimension absent from simple cautionary tales. Atlantis does not merely warn Athens, it forces Athens to recognize its own potential trajectory. The idealized Athens that defeated Atlantis represents not historical Athens, but Athens as it could be if it maintained philosophical governance. The implicit question Plato poses to his contemporary audience is devastating. Which city do you more closely resemble? The Athens that embodied virtue, or the Atlantis that abandoned it? By placing this question within a mythological frame, Plato removes the defensive reactions that direct criticism would provoke. No Athenian need admit personal failure. They need only recognize the structural parallel between Atlantean decline and Athenian trajectory. The mirror works precisely because it appears to reflect someone else. The civilizational diagnostic function transforms Atlantis from historical narrative into analytical instrument. Every element of Atlantean society, its architecture, military organization, legal codes, religious practices, economic systems, functions as a variable that can be mapped onto any civilization to assess its position on the virtue-corruption spectrum. A society whose architecture prioritizes defensive walls over temples has shifted its fundamental orientation from divine service to self-preservation. A society whose military exists for conquest rather than defense has transformed the instrument of protection into the instrument of domination. A society whose legal codes require increasingly elaborate enforcement mechanisms reveals that voluntary compliance, the hallmark of genuine virtue, has eroded to the point where external coercion becomes necessary. Each diagnostic indicator Plato embeds within the Atlantis narrative provides a measurement tool applicable across historical periods and cultural contexts. The eschatological function positions Atlantis within a cosmic framework extending beyond human history into divine temporality. The destruction of Atlantis is not merely political collapse but cosmic event, earthquake and flood operating as instruments of divine will rather than geological accident. This eschatological dimension transforms the narrative from historical account into theological statement. The universe itself is structured to eliminate civilizations that violate fundamental moral principles. This is not punishment in the retributive sense, but correction in the structural sense, the cosmos maintaining its own integrity by removing elements that threaten its coherence. The eschatological function thus provides the ultimate guarantee that moral law is not merely human convention, but cosmic principle, enforceable not by human institutions, but by the structure of reality itself. The pedagogical function operates through what might be termed philosophical inoculation, by presenting the complete arc of civilizational rise and fall within a controlled narrative environment. Plato provides his audience with experiential knowledge of decline without requiring them to undergo the actual process. This is the philosophical equivalent of medical vaccination, exposure to a weakened form of the disease-producing immunity against the full-strength version. Students who have internalized the Atlantis narrative carry within them a pattern recognition template that activates when they encounter analogous dynamics in their own societies. The pedagogical genius lies in making this template narrative, rather than propositional. Stories embed themselves in memory and identity far more effectively than abstract principles, ensuring that the warning persists even when conscious philosophical attention lapses. The prophetic function, perhaps the most controversial, suggests that Plato intended the Atlantis narrative not merely as retrospective analysis, but as prospective prediction. The patterns he identifies are not historically contingent but structurally necessary. Any civilization achieving sufficient material prosperity will face the identical temptation toward moral relaxation, and the outcome is determined not by circumstance, but by response. This prophetic dimension explains why the Atlantis narrative has resonated across 24 centuries of reception. Each generation recognizes its own situation within the pattern Plato describes, not because Plato possessed supernatural foresight, but because he identified dynamics inherent in the structure of civilizational development itself. The synthesis of these functions produces a narrative artifact of extraordinary density and utility. Atlantis operates simultaneously as warning, mirror, diagnostic instrument, eschatological statement, pedagogical tool, and prophetic template, each function reinforcing the others to create a unified analytical framework applicable to any civilization at any point in its developmental trajectory. The fact that this framework remains operational 24 centuries after its creation testifies not to Plato's literary skill, but to his philosophical precision. he identified genuine structural features of civilizational dynamics and encoded them within a narrative form capable of transmitting this knowledge across unlimited temporal distance. The eternal dimension of the warning deserves particular attention. Unlike historical analyses that become obsolete as circumstances change, the Atlantis warning operates at a level of abstraction that renders it permanently applicable. The specific technologies, political structures, and cultural forms of any given civilization are irrelevant to the pattern Plato identifies. What matters is the relationship between material capability and moral orientation. A civilization possessing nuclear technology faces the identical structural challenge as one possessing bronze working capability. The question is not what power is available, but what principles govern its deployment. This abstraction from historical specificity to structural principle is what transforms the Atlantis narrative from ancient Greek mythology into permanent civilizational analysis. The warning's ultimate target is not any particular civilization, but civilization as such, the human project of organizing collective existence according to principles transcending individual desire. Every civilization begins with such principles, whether derived from divine revelation, philosophical reasoning, or cultural tradition. The Atlantean pattern describes what happens when these founding principles are gradually subordinated to the material prosperity they initially enabled. The tragic irony Plato captures is that civilizational success itself generates the conditions for civilizational failure. The wealth and security produced by virtuous governance create the comfort and complacency that erode the virtue responsible for producing them. This self-undermining dynamic is not a flaw in particular civilizations, but a structural feature of civilization itself, a permanent vulnerability requiring permanent vigilance. The mirror's reflective capacity extends beyond political analysis into individual psychology. Each reader of the Atlantis narrative is invited to examine not only their civilization's trajectory, but their own moral orientation. The gradual drift from divine to human standards that characterizes Atlantean decline operates identically at the individual level, the slow replacement of principled decision-making with convenient rationalization, the incremental expansion of acceptable compromise, the progressive normalization of standards that would have been unthinkable to one's younger self. Plato's genius lies in constructing a narrative that functions simultaneously at civilizational and individual scales, recognizing that collective decline is nothing more than the aggregation of individual moral erosion. The final dimension of Atlantis' civilizational mirror and eternal warning is its implicit challenge to every reader. Knowing the pattern, what will you do differently? This challenge is not rhetorical but genuinely open. Plato does not assert that decline is inevitable, only that it is the default trajectory absent conscious resistance. The Atlantis narrative provides both the diagnosis and the implied prescription. Maintain the priority of moral principle over material convenience. Preserve the founding vision against the erosive pressure of prosperity, and recognize that the greatest threat to any civilization comes not from external enemies but from internal complacency. Whether any civilization or any individual can sustain this resistance permanently remains the open question that the Atlantis narrative poses, but deliberately refuses to answer, leaving the responsibility for response where it ultimately belongs, with those who have received the warning.